Hi and welcome to the Talk Sense podcast, a place where we explore practical, hands-on strategies to support children's sensory and communication development, promote neuro-affirming practices and support parents and professionals to change the way you support your child or students, with a focus on what children can do and how we use that as our foundation to help children to thrive every single day. I'm Vicky Robinson, consultant occupational therapist and founder of Sensory Solutions Occupational Therapy Service for Children.
And I'm Joanne Jones, consultant speech and language therapist and founder of the Home of Can Do. We welcome both parents and professionals to join us, to learn from us and to grow your sensory and communication toolbox alongside us. Hi and welcome back to this podcast. We're here today with Amanda. I'm going to hand straight over to Amanda so that she can introduce herself and tell us a little bit about what she gets up to in her professional life. Hi, Amanda.
Okay. Hi. So I'm Amanda Savoury. I have a background in education. So first and foremost, I've been a teacher, qualified teacher for over 30 years now. Gosh, that makes me feel really old. But yeah, so over 30 years. And I have taken steps away from education in that time, but I always seem to be drawn back towards parents and children, children in particular. I think it's one of those, once you start working with children, it's very difficult to break away completely. But alongside my teaching, I am also a qualified touch for health kinesiology practitioner. I'm also a brain gym practitioner, which is a form of educational kinesiology, as well as being qualified in various other holistic methods. So I'm a hypnotherapist as well, NLP practitioner. But the kinesiology and the brain gym are the aspects that I work most with children and their families. So those are the main areas of what I do. I live in Suffolk. We've lived overseas actually for a long time, back in Suffolk now permanently, been here for a couple of years. So I'm now working with children here in England.
Amazing. And I think that we've got to start, because I remember when I first met you, which is a long time ago now, probably like 6 years ago or something. But when
6 or 7, I think, yeah.
Yeah, when I first met you, I heard about kinesiology and I did not have an idea what it was. So for our listeners, can you tell us what is it? Like, what does it entail and where's it come from? Where's its background from?
Yeah, so kinesiology is actually a huge area, and there are various areas of kinesiology that people might know about, like kinesiology taping, so specific work with physios. Some physios use kinesiology, but the form of, or the branch of kinesiology that I work with is specifically for lay people. It's basically, it's quite difficult to explain, but it's all about balancing the whole body. So I'm not just talking about the physical body, we're also talking about the emotions that can have a huge effect on our physical being and body, but also biochemical elements that can also impact and affect our bodies. So when we're looking at, when I look at clients, I'm wanting to find out where imbalances are within the body, because if the body is under any form of stress of any sort, it can't perform at its optimum level. So when I'm working with children, it's exactly the same. If a child is under any form of stress, the body can't perform, it can't develop in the same way that it would normally do. And when we reflect that back into teaching and learning, then a child isn't able to learn in the same way as perhaps if they weren't under any form of stress or if their body wasn't in balance. With children, we also look at brain integration, so integrating left and right sides of brain, making sure that the brain is talking to the body in the best way possible, so that that makes the child more open to learning, more open to development. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
that is kinesiology something that you are familiar with within OT, Vicky?
So I can't get my words out. The taping that you talked about earlier. So yes, I've done training and that side of things. Kinesiology, from my perspective in OT, I guess it's coming more just from like a sensory perspective, really, in terms of learning with the whole body. And like you've said, making that connection between the brain and the body and how all of those neural pathways impact one another and has such a massive effect on all of our areas, sensory development, physical, emotional, cognitive development. So for learning, like you mentioned in the classroom, super important as well. I am interested to hear how you kind of weave that into a family's every day, or like what does it look like on a practical level? Because one of the things that Joe and I really strive to do with the families that we work with is make sure that we don't kind of add extra things on, which as a parent yourself, you know how it's hard to juggle everything, isn't it? So what does it look like in a practical sense?
Okay, so when I've worked with a family, when I work with children, I always make sure that the parents are there if possible, because we do have home play to do. So when I've worked with a child, the work that we do, it's all about moving energies around the body. So that needs to be repeated. And because, as you've said, we want neuro pathways to be developing in the brain, ultimately that is through repetitive movement. So we want the child to be repeating the movements that they need on a regular basis. Now it might be that they only have to do that for a week, or it might be that they have to do that for a couple of weeks, but obviously we don't want that to interfere with their day. Like you've said, you've got enough to do. So everything that we ask the children to do is quite simple, quite quick, and could be done in the car on the way to school. We also encourage the whole family to do them, because quite often, and I say to parents, don't forget about yourself as well. If a parent isn't in balance, if a parent is in stress, that will filter down to the children as well. So everything that we do is non-invasive. Everything that we do is super simple and is something we encourage the whole family to do. And one of the biggest ones that we do is a general, what I call body switch on. And I go through that with all children and all families, because it is of benefit to everyone. So it's 5 simple movements that children can do in the car on the way to school, and that's going to make their body open and receptive to learning. So it's also a very good way to center the left and right sides of the brain, which means it's also quite calming. So it can be done before bedtime, and those individual movements, out of the 5, 3 of them can be used on their own for specific other things as well. So there's always going to be those 5 movements to do at least once a day. And the other movements, like I say, they can just be incorporated into play or into relaxation. And I would never overload a family with a list of things to do, because that's most of the work will have been done in the session anyway.
Oh, okay, so you work with families in sessions and then give them kind of homework, if you like, to work on.
Yeah, I don't call it homework, I call it home play. I take to call it homework. But yeah, and ultimately it is a choice whether the family want to do that additional work or not. The way that I work as a kinesiologist, I don't work with families on a weekly basis. It's not perhaps like occupational therapy or physiotherapy where I say, oh, you need to come so many times. We have a method called muscle testing, which means that I can specifically ask the child's body when it wants another balance, when they need to come back and see me. And quite often I don't see children for sometimes 6 weeks, sometimes 3 months. Every child is different. So it's not a long term treatment, if you like. I see children generally when parents see changes, they come back to me. So when we see behaviour changes, particularly when I work with retained baby reflexes, which is something that I've spoken to Joanne about before, we often see I often see children again when another potential reflex has become retained and needs help to move on. So, yeah.
So are those two things always done together, the retained reflexes and the kinesiology, or is that two kind of different things that you bring together within your practice?
So within my practice, when I'm working with children, the two main areas that come up are I'll use what's called brain gym, which is integration of right and left side of brain, which really assists with learning. So I do a lot of work in brain gym to do with handwriting or reading or writing itself or comprehension or thinking, but the retained baby reflexes is very different, and I will always check a child first to see whether this is the branch we need to go down, because quite often a retained reflex will have an effect on behaviour. It will have an effect on development, so whether that's physical or emotional development, and the reflexes work in a very particular way. So they work like dominoes, so they develop sequentially. So if there is a problem with one reflex, the chances are there may be a problem with other reflexes down the line. So we have to work with the first reflex that has become stuck, if you like, in order to almost knock the other ones on. So the retained reflex work, I always check for that first, and quite often, particularly with things like speech development, or trying to think of another one, almost like shyness and timidity. Another effect of a retained reflex might be children who are I'm trying to think just off the top of my head, children who've got problems with pencil grip. That's another reflex, the open and close of the reflexes. So quite often when I work with children, I will always do that check first, and often that is the branch that we will end up going down. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think the primitive reflexes kind of, it just underpins everything that we do, really, doesn't it? You know, if we look at the hierarchy of how we develop skills,
Yes.
you know, I often talk to parents about this Jenga tower being our body and all of the systems and all of the skills that we develop. And at the bottom of that Jenga tower, you know, you've got your primitive reflexes, and then the next layer up is your sensory processing.
Yeah.
And then the next layer up, you know, we could go into things like our gross motor skills and our fine motor skills, and then our higher level skills of things like writing and behavior and communication, interaction, self-esteem, confidence. You know, it's all stacked, isn't it? And there's such an overlap between, I feel, the reflex integration and the sensory integration work, because ultimately they feed into one another. And a lot of the time, kind of the functional exercises that I would suggest for parents to do, that's working on their sensory systems around their vestibular and their proprioceptive processing, which I'm sure we'll go into more detail in other podcast episodes. So don't worry if you're a parent listening to this thinking, what on earth are those words that Vicky's talking about? You know, a lot of those skills, those movements that we're stimulating those sensors, also help to integrate those reflexes, don't they? Because ultimately it's all kind of intertwined in the central nervous system, and it really does just have such a ripple effect on so many areas.
Yeah. Huge. And it's interesting saying about that stacking tower. My analogy, and I've got a diagram that I show parents, is a bucket. And I say, if we haven't got the reflexes plugging the holes in it's a bucket with holes in. If the reflex work has almost fallen through the holes, everything else does too. And we need to plug the holes in the bucket with the reflex work in order for everything else to fall into place. So it's interesting that you have a similar kind of analogy. Yeah, no, it is. It's fascinating work, and I think it's something that quite often is I'm not going to say ignored. I don't want to use that word, but a lot of people have never even heard of primitive reflexes.
I think that's it. I think it's just lack of awareness of it,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, a lot of us as therapists have that challenge because, from a medical world, we're looking at what's the evidence, it's all of these high level trials and research that's been done. And actually, for the children that we work with, for all of us therapists, you're never going to get two children the same. They're all different, and it's really difficult to have those, standardized trials where you're trying different approaches on children because you don't have a group of children that are all exactly the same. And that's
Exactly.
what makes it really challenging, but also really exciting to work with these children because they keep us on our toes and we have to try different things, and we have to be open as therapists trying all of these different approaches. For some children, doing reflex integration work that I work with just works amazingly. For other children, it's the sensory. For other children, I come to Joe and I'm like, Joe, tell me like what I could be doing here. And a lot of Joe's can do works massively well for a lot of the children. So I think it's just having all of these tools in your toolkit. But definitely I agree in terms of the reflex integration work is not very well recognized, but also I think just a lot of parents have just never heard of it before.
No, and I think this, when I first spoke to Joanne about the reflexes, I think I'm not saying, I think there is a real place, like you've talked about the medical side, there is a real place for that, but there are so many other things out there that can help. And it makes me really sad that I often see children as a bit of a last resort. And that makes me really sad that people come to me when they've tried so many different things. And I think it would be wonderful if the message could be spread that there are other things out there. If you don't want to go down that medical route to help your child, there are other things out there that you can be involved in as a parent to really help and make you feel like you're doing the work as well, to help your child move through these things. And also, certainly when I lived overseas, I was going into schools and I was going into nurseries talking about these things to help nursery teachers to recognise some of the signs of a retained reflex, to help them with just everyday activities that they could put into place in nurseries, where they could be doing activities that would help integrate those reflexes for all children, whether they'd got one that was stuck or not. But I think, just trying to spread that word a little bit and talk to people about other options and how you can help. And we did talks for parents as well, which was really interesting, and helped them to almost, you could see light bulbs going on and pennies dropping and things, a lot of jigsaw pieces fitting together of things that they hadn't understood potentially why their child behaved in a certain way or had a problem with certain things. So yeah, so it's hugely, like you say, it's hugely rewarding. I think because it is a little bit kind of unknown, that makes it rewarding too, because we can educate people at the same time with what else is out there.
Yeah, definitely. And for some of the parents listening who may not have heard of retained reflexes, why might a child have retained a reflex?
Okay, so there are many reasons why a child might have a retained reflex. So quite often, what I always say to parents is it's nobody's fault. So this isn't something that they've done. It's nobody's fault. But the other thing is, and I do point this out as well, is that a retained reflex generally won't be cured on its own. Children are very clever and they will camouflage reflexes, and they learn to do that because they know what they should and shouldn't do. But sometimes in life, or when a child is very small, or even in pregnancy, some things happen that cause stresses. And when I talk to parents about this, they'll go, oh yes, I had a really stressful pregnancy, or my child was delivered by C-section. That's one of the things that I always ask. And again, it's nobody's fault. It could be an emergency. A child may have had assisted breathing when they were first born, or they may have had some long-term illness. Not always, but sometimes these might have been factors that happened in the early stages. So the 14 reflexes that I deal with most are reflexes that are developed within the first, right from conception through to the first 2 years of a child's life. And like I say, they happen in a particular order. So the first reflex, which is kind of there, it emerges at birth, at conception. And each reflex goes through 3 stages. So they emerge, and then what happens is they develop, and then they're supposed to integrate. So they're supposed to go away. And sometimes if something happens in that process, there will be a block somewhere within there. So it might be that a reflex has emerged, or it might be that it's emerged but they're not developed, or it might be that it hasn't emerged at all. So if I give you an example, the one that I usually use that people understand is there is a reflex called the spinal reflex, and it is there to help a baby be born. So it's a reflex within the spine that causes the back to move a little bit, and it emerges at around about 9 months. And the development of this reflex is the movement of the back, which is supposed to be there to help a baby move down the birth canal. So if a baby's born naturally, generally that spinal reflex will have developed. And then once the baby is born, the message goes to the brain, which says, right, baby's born, we can integrate that reflex now and it can go away. However, if for any reason there's been a problem at birth, so maybe there's had to be an emergency C-section, the baby's been taken out of mum's tummy, the brain doesn't register that. So the reflex in the back is still trying to develop and has this, it doesn't have a physical movement, but it's ready to do this movement to get it down the birth canal. So what tends to happen is these are children that find it difficult to wear some fabrics against their back. They might be really sensitive to labels because it's irritating, because their back is very sensitive, because this reflex is still active. It's not been integrated. It might be that you run your finger down their spine and they'll go and react jump away because their back is so sensitive. You see it in adults that don't like sitting against hard chairs. So there's a real problem for some children in school. They've got to wear a uniform, which might be really, really scratchy. They've then got these labels that they don't like. They're then told to sit on hard plastic chairs, which is uncomfortable for them. So they can mask this reflex because they know they've got to sit still. But in doing that, they're not focused on their learning. So they're focused on, I must sit still, I must sit still, I must sit still. So what we do is we can test to see if this reflex is out, and then we can do simple movements, repetitive movements that will send a message to the brain to say, we don't need this reflex anymore. You can integrate and go away. And they literally are simple pre-birth movements that would have happened to the child or the baby as it was going down the birth canal. Does that make it a bit easier?
Yeah. It's really interesting, isn't it? And then it's like the behaviour that you see in the class can be different. So in that example that you've just given, you've got the child who is having to focus so hard on staying still, sitting still, so that they don't get the scratch from their clothes, they don't get the feel from the back of the chair. Those are the children who are likely to be very quiet, well behaved in class, because they're focusing so hard on that, managing those sensations, but actually they're not fulfilling their potential in the classroom because they're not able to divide their attention well between how is my body feeling and how am I inhibiting some of these feelings so that I can then focus on the cognitive work that's in front of me, whether it's reading or writing or listening to instructions. So these, they might miss verbal instructions from the teacher.
Absolutely.
Or, they can't keep up with the writing task that's being given in class and they kind of fall behind. And then you've got the other children who are probably described as, ants in their pants. So they're fidgeting.
It can't sit still.
Because they're moving to try to take away that feeling, that the sensation that they're not enjoying. And instinctively our body, our brain tries to get you away from something that feels threatening or uncomfortable. And so, you have children, you could potentially have two children sat in a room with this retained spinal reflex who present in different ways. And so it's important that we can screen for those and that we can understand the underlying behaviour, because the behaviour is just the end result, isn't it?
And another lovely example of that is the fear paralysis reflex, which is the first reflex that develops. And that can show itself in two incredibly different ways in children. Particularly we see when children are in unfamiliar circumstances. So the fear paralysis reflex is there. All the reflexes are there to help us survive. They're survival things. So the reflex is there to say, is somewhere safe to be? And that's what the fear paralysis reflex is. So is this environment safe for me to be in? And when a child first goes to school or nursery or is going to somewhere away from their parent, we see this in two different children. I saw it a lot as a teacher. So we see the child that clings desperately to mummy. So the normal reaction of a child would be, I'm going to cling to mummy, that's okay, because I don't know this place. But then they'll do a scan. They'll go, oh, lovely activities, lovely teacher, those children look happy, and off they'll go. So the actual initial, I need to be with mummy, isn't a problem, but it's the fact of those children that won't let go. I need to be with mummy and I can't, because I can't judge whether this environment is safe for me. So I'm going to stay with mummy, that's safer. So you've got that aspect. Then you've got the other aspect at the other end of the spectrum. And these are the children where that reflex hasn't even developed at all, because they go straight into an unknown environment with no fear. And you hear parents saying, oh yes, my little, my child, they were fine going into school, they ran in. But these are also the children that might run into a playground with no fear at all, dive off a slide or dive into a swimming pool without it, because they haven't even done the scan. So you've got those two children with a problem with the same reflex, but one is hanging on to mum for dear life and one has gone because they have no fear. So those are two aspects again which are really interesting to watch, because they, like you say, it's the same reflex but completely different behavior patterns for that.
You know what's so sad when I'm listening to all this and I think about those children, because then they go into school or they're within their families and they start to get layered on these kind of, oh well, she's just shy, she won't do that,
Labels,
he can't do that. And you just think that their experience of life is then all of these kind of layers that everybody's very well meaning for and doesn't know any different from, but is very unhelpful. And like in my mind, I'm like, why are we not like screening even at school starting point children for these reflexes, and so that every child goes in there with a bit of a deeper understanding, because I think the system's struggling with the children who have got the greatest needs, but there's a whole raft of these children underneath that have got needs that are not even understood, let alone being supported.
Yeah, and I think, that's why it was so wonderful to be able to go into nurseries, to be able to say, look for these children. This is what you might be seeing. Look for the children who suck on their hair. Look for the children who suck on their clothes, because simple activities that you can put into practice in your nursery can really help those children without us even getting involved. And I think that sort of education for those early years practitioners, not just parents, but the early years practitioners as well, is really, really useful, and another tool for them to use, knowing that they can really help these children's development, and knowing what to look for. But you're absolutely right, Joanne, you know, and that's why, you know, I see a lot of parents who don't want their children to go on to medication for ADHD or other things, and you know, hopefully we can help in some way, shape or form, to slow that process down a little bit and look at other, you know, not always, but it might be a reflex. And I always say not always, but it might be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's so interesting to talk to you. And, you know, we've had quite a few conversations on these podcasts that have been about like looking at the whole child. You know, I'm a big, said for a long time that in medicine and in development, we've all become too specialized. We've all got this little bit that we look at, but actually we need generalists. We need to be looking at whole systems, whole bodies, whole experiences, and helping children to move forward. And you know, this is just another of those conversations that kind of says, yeah, that is absolutely what we need. We need this multi way of looking at it. It's not even professionals, because different professionals have different ways within their own work, don't they? So yeah. So if people wanted to work with you, is it something that you have to be hands-on? Can it be online? How does that work?
So I work in different ways. With children, I do prefer to work in person. However, it is possible to work online. And the reason being that as kinesiologists, we use a method called muscle testing to get the information from the body that we need. In order to muscle test, we can use what we call a surrogate. So it's a little bit out there, but we can use surrogates, and we use surrogates when we work with babies. We use surrogates when we work with the elderly, so people that we can't physically muscle test themselves, or even people who are, you know, so ill that they couldn't, you know, physically we couldn't move them around. So in these cases, I often use the mum as a surrogate, because obviously they have a super bond with the child, or I use myself, which sounds a bit out there, but I can still do the muscle testing online, and then I can then, through a Zoom call, show the corrections, do them on myself, show the parent what to do as well. What I always do is I always do a free consultation first, because I need to know that we're all on the same page with expectations, that we're going to be the best fit for each other. And sometimes I have said to people, you know, look in your area for a kinesiologist, but look for an educational kinesiologist, somebody who works with retained reflexes and works with children. I do feel blessed with my teaching background in that I feel I've got quite a broad sort of picture of children and where they need to be within their own child development, within their own learning. So I would often say to people, make sure you're working with somebody who has worked with children before, or is trained in educational kinesiology. But if they want to work with me, yes, they can work with me in person. I'm here in Suffolk. I work out of a clinic in a place called Beccles. Go to my website, which is amandasavoury.com. Have a look on there. Drop me a message on through there or through my Facebook page, and we can talk some more.
And if you're an adult that felt like you might have some of these difficulties, is there a point where it's too late to get that support? I'm thinking.
Not at all, not at all. And I often end up working with the whole family, to be honest. I don't just do the retained reflex work, I do other things as well. But yes, I have worked with adults. I see adults, and the big one, and you might know somebody of this, but the big one is tongue poking out when you're concentrating. There are a lot of adults out there who, when they're concentrating, their tongue comes out, and that is the Babkin reflex. So it's another reflex that could have got stuck somewhere along the line. Again, people who have struggled with social situations, that you can see it in adults as well. So yeah, I do work with adults too. Yeah, it's never too late.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I feel like we've not even scratched the surface, and that we could have you back for another podcast episode. We didn't even get on to kind of like some of the things that you'd come with your big message. We just got stuck in and found out more about you. So thank you so much. And
You're welcome. No, thanks for having me. It's been fun. I'll come back again for sure. But if anybody's got any questions, they can just ping me a message, because it is a really broad topic. And as you know, I love talking about it. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any queries another time.
Oh, lovely. Lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.